The keycard printer jammed again at exactly 2:47 a.m. That was the third time that winter, always the same hour, always that grinding click like it didn't want to spit the card out. Len was downstairs doing rounds and I was alone at the front desk. Snow tapped gently against the windows in that soft, constant way that made it easy to forget how cold it really was outside. And then I heard the lobby door open. No footsteps, no voice, just that soft chime, and then silence. When I looked up, a man was already standing at the counter, coat soaked, hood up, not moving. He didn't blink when I greeted him. He just placed a room key on the desk, one of ours, and whispered, "Not until 2:47. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever stayed somewhere that just didn't feel quite right." And if these stories help keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened, working nights at a mountain lodge about 4 hours west of Denver. It wasn't fancy, but it stayed busy during ski season, mostly families, and cross-country hikers, the occasional loner just looking to disappear into snow for a few nights. This place was built in the late 70s, all pine beams and creaky baseboards. No cell service, barely any Wi-Fi, and one landline behind the desk that only worked when it felt like it. I didn't mind the quiet. My kids were grown and off in college, and after my divorce, the solitude suited me. Until that winter. This all happened over the course of one night, but it stayed with me ever since. It started during the third big snowstorm of the season. One of those whiteouts that moves in fast and makes it feel like the world beyond the parking lot just ends. We had 7 guests checked in 4 couples, and one solo traveler who'd arrived just before the roads closed. I only ever referred to him as the quiet man because he never gave a name, paid cash, didn't speak much, just asked for a room with no windows facing the forest. He checked in around 9:15 p.m., and I remember the time exactly because he slid an old watch across the counter and said, "Wake-up call at 2:47. Not 2:45, not 3:00, 2:47. I asked if he meant 7. Here, we sometimes got folks confused by jet lag, but he just nodded and took his key. Didn't take the complimentary cider. Didn't ask about the breakfast hour. He walked off without even removing his gloves. I radioed Len, our overnight maintenance guy, just to let him know we had another guest on the 3rd floor. Len had worked there longer than I had quiet man ex-military salt and pepper beard that made him look 10 years older than 48. He didn't talk much, but he noticed everything. About an hour later, he came back down and said the guy hadn't touched anything in the room. Didn't unpack, didn't turn the heater up, just stood at the window, looking out toward the tree line. Around 11 Huzra, the wind picked up. I went into the laundry room to check the dryer, and when I came back, the front desk light was flickering. That wasn't unusual. The bulbs sometimes buzzed when the power grid got overloaded. But what struck me was the lobby door. It had snowdrift piled against the inside of the threshold like it had been opened for several minutes. There were no boot prints leading in, just snow. And on the front desk laid carefully next to the bell was the key to room 307, the quiet man's room. I picked it up, confused, checked the camera feed. The feed had frozen at 2:46 and never restarted. I radioed Len again, but got only static. I remember suddenly feeling like the whole building was empty, like I'd stepped out of time somehow, or the power wasn't just off, it was elsewhere. That's when the printer jammed. I walked around the desk, fiddled with the jammed card, and heard something behind me. Not footsteps exactly, more like the low groan of wood settling under weight. I turned, expecting to see Len. Instead, the quiet man was standing 5 feet from the desk, not wet, not winded, just there. His parka was zipped up tight, but I noticed his hands pale, stiff, like he'd been standing in sub-zero temperatures without gloves. He stared straight at me, then down at the key, then said it again, clear as day. Not until 2:47. Len came back down around 1:30 a.m., said the power was stable, backup generator was online, and all doors were locked. I asked if he'd seen the guest from 307. He hadn't. We checked the hallway camera feed together, frozen still at 2:46, same as the lobby cam. All we could see was static snow, whiteout. We went up to the room. It was empty. Bed untouched, heater off, window open. On the nightstand, a leather snowmobile key fob, cracked and worn with the letters C. Vaughn, 2015, burned into it. Neither of us recognized the name. At 2:40 a.m., Len suggested we do a sweep of the exterior. Snow was thick but manageable. We bundled up, grabbed flashlights, and stepped outside into the storm. We didn't see him, but we heard it. 3 slow knocks. Not on the door on the side of the building near the staff entrance. We turned, shining our lights toward the sound. Nothing. Then 3 more knocks. This time on the window of room 104. Len drew his breath in slow. "That room's vacant," he said. By the time we got back inside, it was 2:47 exactly. Every clock in the building flipped to that time at once, lobby clock, break room, system, terminal. All of them synced. The cameras came back online 2 minutes later. Nothing unusual. No one in the lobby. No fresh footprints. And room 307, still open, still cold, still empty. We checked guest logs the next day. No C. Vaughn had ever stayed with us. No one matching the quiet man's description had checked in anywhere nearby. Len asked me to delete the camera footage. Said some things don't want to be watched twice. I kept 1 frame, just one, from the night vision cam in the hallway. It shows a man standing motionless near room 307. His eyes are faintly reflective, his mouth slightly open. The timestamp reads 2:47 a.m. I still have it, and every winter when the first snow hits hard against my window, I check the time. Always. Just in case. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people look at you like you've said too much, like they're hoping you'll laugh and say you were just messing with them. But I wasn't. And I'm not. The year was 2021. I was 22, taking a break from college and picking up overnight shifts at a fuel stop along the Dalton Highway, mile 237, right where the road starts to forget how to end. The place had 2 gas pumps, a flickering street lamp out front, and a tiny convenience store that smelled like antifreeze and beef jerky. Most nights it was just me, the wind, and whatever truckers dared the storm. Eugene, the owner, only came in during daylight. He was one of those old Alaska types, silent, weathered, always tapping the counter like a slow clock. Whenever you asked a question he didn't want to answer. The first time I saw the truck was on my 3rd Wednesday. I remember the snow had been coming down sideways since midnight. One of those blizzards that turns everything into shapes and shadows. At 2:00 a.m., sharp headlights slid into view through the storm. An old blue Chevy rolled up to pump 4 rusted body-idle engine ticking, like it had all the time in the world. The driver didn't get out, didn't roll down the window, just sat there, engine humming steady. At first I figured he'd fallen asleep. I grabbed my jacket, pushed through the door, and stepped into the snow, which swallowed the sound of everything except that low rumble from the truck. Before I got within 10 feet, the reverse lights came on. The truck backed away, smooth, not hurried, not hesitant. Then it vanished into the dark, leaving behind nothing but half-covered tire tracks. I logged it in the shift book, figured it was a one-off. But the next Wednesday, same time, same storm, same truck, pulled up to pump 4, sat there for exactly 10 minutes, then disappeared. This time I watched from the camera monitor instead of going out. The footage was low-quality, grainy, but something about the way the driver sat there, motionless, hands on the wheel, made my skin crawl. There was no breath on the glass, no shifting, no sign of life at all. I brought it up to Eugene the next morning. Said it like a joke, half hoping he'd say it was just a local who liked to spook the new guy. But he didn't laugh, didn't even look at me. Just said, "Storm season does strange things. You'll get used to it." Then he started drumming his fingers again. Tap, tap, tap. By the third Wednesday, I'd made up my mind to record everything. I swapped shifts to make sure I was on duty. Downloaded a copy of the old station software so I could save the camera footage to a USB. The storm rolled in like it knew what time it was. By 1:45 a.m., visibility was down to maybe 15 feet, and right on cue at 2:00 a.m., sharp, the blue Chevy pulled in. This time I zoomed the camera all the way in. The driver was still no movement, no fog on the windshield. But his hands, they looked wrong. Too stiff, too gray, like they'd been carved from wax and left too long in the cold. The truck sat there for 10 minutes, then began to back away. But just before it turned, the headlights swept across the lot, and I caught a flash of the man's face. Sunken cheeks, leathered skin, eyes that didn't reflect light, and an expression so blank it didn't even register as human. I stumbled back from the monitor, had to sit down. Saved the footage twice, once to the USB, once to the system itself. Then I went looking through the old shift logs, found a binder going back years, tucked behind the spare air filters. The earliest mention I could find was from 1993. Entry at 2:04 a.m. described an unmoving vehicle at pump 4, a blue Chevy. After that, notes appeared sporadically, always in winter, always on Wednesdays, always during storms. Then I found the folder labeled Incident, Law Enforcement. Buried in the back, inside missing person reports, photocopied police forms. A newspaper clipping from January 1992 about a man named Walter Ricks. Disappeared during a blizzard while driving home from a mining camp. Truck never found. Neither was his body. The article included a photo. It was grainy but unmistakable. That was the man I'd seen behind the wheel. No question. 2 nights later, Wednesday came again. This time I didn't wait behind the monitor. I wanted to see it for myself. At 1:58 a.m., I heard the engine. Low, steady. The blue Chevy slid into place like it had never left. I walked out with a flashlight and a baseball bat I'd borrowed from the supply room. The snow was falling differently around the truck. It didn't stick. It slid off the hood like oil on water. No frost on the glass. No warmth either. I approached the driver's side slowly, raised my light, and that's when the power inside the station cut out. All at once, lights, pumps, cameras gone. Even my flashlight flickered, then died. In the dark, I heard the truck door creak open. I turned, ready to run, but the station, dark a second ago, was now lit from within. Pale light, not electric. Soft, steady, unnatural. Through the front window, I saw a figure inside. Too tall, too thin. Wearing a winter coat identical to the one in the article photo. Walter. Frost began to spread across the glass where he stood. It crawled outward, forming delicate veins like cracked porcelain. He raised his hand, and through the frost his mouth moved. I couldn't hear the words, but I understood them. Still looking for Pump 4. I stepped back, heart-hammering snow soaking through my shoes. Behind me, I heard the truck engine still running, still idling, still waiting. I turned around. The truck was empty. The door hung open like a mouth. When I looked back toward the station, Walter wasn't alone. 3 other figures stood behind him now, all dressed for winter, all watching me. Their mouths moved together in unison. No sound, just a message forming in frost across the window. Help us find the way. I ran around the back key, fumbling in my frozen hands, got inside, locked the door. Power came back a second later like nothing had happened. When police arrived 20 minutes later, there was nothing to see. No truck, no prints, no frost. Just me, pale and shaking behind the counter. I quit the next morning, left Alaska that same month. But sometimes in the early hours of a snowstorm, I dream about that frost tracing words I was never meant to read. And I still wonder what happens when someone finally says, "Yes, I've lived in Washington most of my life." But in the fall of 2019, I flew up to Alaska to spend 5 days with my dad on a moose hunting trip in the Copper River Basin. It was supposed to be a reset. I'd been burnt out spending too many nights staring at spreadsheets and code. The plan was simple. Hike deep into the valley, set up camp, unplug from everything. But there's something about silence that doesn't always feel peaceful. Sometimes it feels like you're being studied. We'd talked about doing this trip for years. Dad had been hunting those ridges since I was in middle school. He knew every pass, every bend in the creek, and the exact distance from the trailhead to each campsite. It was early October, just cold enough to see your breath in the mornings, but still warm enough to sleep without freezing. We parked his old Silverado off a gravel road, hiked in about 6 miles, and set up camp near a slow-moving creek surrounded by spruce and birch. The first day passed exactly how I'd imagined. No cell signal, no traffic noise, just the crunch of leaves and the quiet sound of river water against rocks. We sat around the fire that night, drinking from a shared thermos and talking about nothing important. Dad was in a good mood, the kind of easygoing calm he only ever had when he was deep in the woods. He told stories about past hunts, ones I'd heard a dozen times, but still nodded along to. The next morning, we set out early, following a game trail that wound uphill through rocky outcroppings and clusters of alder brush. About 3 hours in, Dad stopped suddenly. He was staring at something maybe 30 yards ahead, eyes narrowed. I walked up beside him and saw it too, what was left of a caribou. It wasn't just a kill site. The bones had been arranged, perfectly clean bones stripped with an almost surgical precision laid out in a circle around a flat boulder. The skull sat neatly in the center, facing upward. No tracks, no blood, no sign of a struggle. Dad crouched beside it and ran his fingers over one of the femurs. He didn't say anything at first, which worried me more than if he'd cursed or laughed. Then he said, "I've never seen anything like this, Kevin. Not even close." We kept hiking, both of us quieter now. About 2 miles further, we found another site. This time, a ptarmigan. Small bird, but the bones had been arranged the same way, spread in a clean pattern around a smooth river stone. No feathers, no drag marks, just another perfect circle in the middle of the woods. That night, neither of us said much over the fire. Dad sharpened his knife for nearly an hour without using it. I kept checking the dark space between the trees, feeling like something was just beyond the light. We took turns keeping watch, which we'd never done before. He didn't explain. He just said, "I'll take first shift," and that was that. By day 3, the pattern escalated. We found more remains, squirrel bones arranged around a chunk of quartz marten bones circled around a flat piece of shale. Each one more recent than the last. Some still had that faint, coppery smell of death. Still no tracks, no sign of scavengers, just bones cleaned and placed with care. Dad stopped carrying his rifle on his back. He held it across his chest, now finger near the trigger guard. I noticed he kept glancing behind us, even when the trail was narrow. It was like we weren't alone anymore, and we both knew it. That night we camped in a tight clearing surrounded by tall spruce. We built a fire big enough to cast light in every direction. He didn't even bother pretending to sleep. I dozed off around midnight and woke up to him whispering my name. He pointed across the clearing voice, barely above breath. Over there, between those 2 trees. I looked. 2 golden eyes about 8 feet off the ground reflecting the firelight. They didn't move, didn't blink, they just stared. Not green like a moose or a bear. Not even the pale blue of a fox. These were golden, steady, intelligent. Like whatever was watching us understood exactly what we were. We stayed like that until dawn. When the sun finally filtered through the trees, the eyes were gone. No sound, no scent, no tracks. Like it had never been there at all. On the 4th day, we hiked to the top of a ridge. Dad was scanning the far slope with his binoculars when he went stiff. Then he handed them to me, hand shaking. I looked. There it was. A black wolf the size of a horse. It stood at the edge of the opposite ridge, watching us. Not sniffing the air, not pacing, just standing. The fur on its back shimmered silver in the sunlight like metallic thread. It didn't flinch, didn't move, and even at that distance, I could feel it thinking. Dad muttered, "It's been tracking us." Then the wolf turned and walked along the ridge. Its gait was smooth, deliberate, almost unnatural. Every 100 yards it would stop, turn its head back toward us, wait, then continue. It wanted us to see it, to know it had been there the whole time. And it wanted us to understand that we weren't the hunters out here. I think that's when Dad truly accepted it. That this wasn't just some territorial animal. This was something older, something smarter. We packed up camp without speaking. No jokes, no plans, just the shared understanding that we needed to leave. The hike back took 6 hours. Every now and then I'd look up at the ridgelines. I never saw the eyes again, but I knew they were still watching. Dad sold his hunting gear the following spring. I never asked why. We haven't spoken about it since, but I still remember the bones arranged like offerings. I remember how clean they were, how careful, like something wanted us to know it had been close and that it let us go. I've worked in wildlife conservation for over a decade. I've tracked elk migrations across Montana, filmed grizzlies during denning season, and once had to dart a cougar from a canoe. But the field season near the Yukon border in 2019, that's the one I still dream about. Not for what we found, but for what disappeared. I was 30 then, a field assistant on Dr. Ron Baxter's caribou migration study. We were based out of a ranger's cabin 40 miles from the nearest road near the Porcupine Caribou Herd's western range. It was late September, and we were prepping to extract GPS collar data before snowfall made travel impossible. 43 collars had gone silent in the span of 5 days. Not a single SOS ping, no dropped batteries, just vanished. Dr. Baxter thought it was a glitch. He was always one to downplay stress in the team. But Mark, our field tech, looked pale when he pulled up the last known cluster. All 43 had last pinged within a 5-mile radius, along a bend in the Shale River. That zone wasn't easy to access, but with drones and snowmobiles, we figured we could at least rule out environmental damage. Frost, maybe, or rockslide interference. Kayla launched the drone the next morning around 5:30 a.m. It was still dark, but the thermal sensors were excellent. We stood huddled around the screen with coffee in our gloves, watching as the drone glided over the silent forest. The caribou weren't there, but 7 heat signatures were. Not 4-legged, not scattered. 7 upright, human-sized shapes moving slowly in a line. Each figure kept exactly the same distance from the next, like they were tethered. We said nothing for a full minute. Then Kayla whispered, "They're not wearing cold gear. There's no color gradient, just uniform heat." Dr. Baxter insisted they were hunters, but there'd been no permit logs filed for that area, no camps, no vehicles. Mark watched the replay 6 times, then asked Kayla to scrub ahead. She did, and all 7 figures had stopped completely in the middle of a clearing. Then, in a blink, the feed glitched, and they were gone. We hiked out to that same clearing the next afternoon. No footprints, no droppings. But we found something worse. A collar. It was buried 6 inches under undisturbed snow. Still functioning, still transmitting. There's no way that device could have ended up under snow that had no compression pattern. Mark barely spoke for the rest of the day. That night I heard him outside around 2:00 a.m., pacing by the supply shed. I called out, but he didn't answer. In the morning, his bunk was empty. We searched for hours. Finally, down by the riverbank, Kayla saw something out of place near a fallen birch. It was Mark's boots, perfectly side by side, toes facing the water. No tracks, no drag marks, no sign he'd even walked there. We filed the report with SAR. They searched the area for a week. Nothing. They chalked it up to disorientation, maybe hypothermia. But they couldn't explain the boots, or the drone footage, or why in the days after every time Kayla launched the drone, it would return with a single frozen smear across the lens like something had passed too close, too fast. We shut down the study a month early. Dr. Baxter never mentioned the footage again. I still have a screen grab from the thermal, just a frame. 7 figures in a line evenly spaced. Too warm, too still, and too far from anywhere people should have been. We tagged that footage false positives, wind shadows. But none of us believed it, not really. I've never gone back to that part of the border. And if I ever do, I won't follow the river. I'll stay above the tree line, and I'll never ever wear boots I can't run in. I was between jobs that winter, and the Fairwood Lodge had a help-wanted post for seasonal staff. They needed someone to prep the bathhouse before guests arrived each evening. Light candles mop the cedar floor, check the propane tanks. It wasn't much, but the pay covered meals, and they gave me a room upstairs above the main lodge. That was enough. The place wasn't fancy. Just 8 cabins and a communal bathhouse tucked against the spruce tree line, all running on a finicky generator, and a few satellite hotspots that barely reached past the office. The guests were usually groups hunting buddies, retired couples chasing auroras, once even a yoga retreat that froze their mats stiff outside. But the group that came through in late January stuck with me. 3 people, 2 men and a woman, who didn't quite match. The lodge register said Troy David and Amanda. I remember thinking they didn't seem like close friends. David did all the talking during check-in. Troy barely looked up from his phone. Amanda just nodded along and carried the bags. They'd reserved cabin 3 right by the tree line. It was always the coldest one, and I told them that. David smiled and said, "That's the point." I didn't press. They kept to themselves mostly. Amanda came by the front desk twice to ask about nearby trails, but they didn't book any excursions. I only saw them together once on the second evening walking toward the bathhouse around 9 p.m. It had dropped to -18. They were bundled up laughing about something, and Troy was carrying a little Bluetooth speaker in his glove. I cleaned cabin 3 the next morning, just a courtesy sweep since they'd be there all week, and I remember the bathroom mirror was fogged, even though no one had showered yet. There were also 2 coffee mugs in the sink, but only 1 spoon, and the Bluetooth speaker was sitting on the edge of the tub, still playing static. That night, around 10:30, Carl the manager knocked on my door. He was half-dressed, boots unlaced, parka over pajamas. "We've got a guest missing," he said. "Help me check the bathhouse." He didn't say who, but I already knew. It was the only place Troy ever went, bathhouse, cabin, bathhouse. David and Amanda were waiting by the snowmobile shed, both wrapped in blankets and visibly shaken. David said Troy had gone out around 8:30, said he wanted to soak alone before bed. He hadn't come back. Carl and I walked the path down with flashlights. The snow had stopped an hour earlier, and there weren't many footprints, mostly ours back and forth during setup. But about halfway down the trail, we found something that didn't sit right. A glove. Just one. Dark blue with a rip across the thumb. It was lying off to the side of the path like it had been dropped while running. The bathhouse was empty, lights off. The candles I'd lit earlier were melted flat, the hot water pipe hissing low, like it hadn't been used in a while. No towels on the bench, no phone. Carl kept saying maybe he walked past us. Maybe he got cold and went back toward the main lodge. But the thing was, there were no footprints heading back, just ours going down. By midnight, Carl called the local trooper outpost. They couldn't send a full team, but a pair of rangers arrived by 2:30 a.m. They interviewed all of us, took notes, snapped photos, and then left to sweep the tree line with thermal gear. By sunrise, they'd found him. Troy was half buried in snow 30 yards behind the bathhouse near the creek. He had 3 stab wounds, 1 in the shoulder and 2 in the lower back. He was still alive, barely, and had crawled part way toward the lodge before passing out. His parka was torn open and his phone was crushed in one pocket. They airlifted him to Anchorage, and that afternoon, troopers returned with a different tone. Amanda and David were taken to separate rooms. I overheard Amanda sobbing in the hallway, saying, "I didn't know he was going to do it." They arrested David just after dinner. Turns out Troy had filed a restraining order against him back in 2012. No one knew why they were traveling together again, not even Amanda, apparently. The lodge emptied fast after that. Guests canceled bookings. Staff left early. Carl offered me a bonus to stay the last 2 weeks, and I did mostly because I had nowhere else lined up. But I slept with my door locked and never used the bathhouse again. Before I left, I checked cabin 3 one last time. There was a note tucked under the bed frame, just one line in pencil on the lodge stationery. He said this would fix everything. I never found out if it was Troy who wrote it, or Amanda, or David trying to make sense of what he'd done. The snow buried that trail again by February. They shut the lodge down for repairs. But even years later, I still think about that bathhouse, how quiet it felt when we stepped inside, how warm the floorboards were, even though no one had used the water, and how that one glove stayed frozen to the ground long after the others melted. I used to work at a fishing camp outside Bethel, the kind where tourists fly in on float planes and pretend they're roughing it for a week. Twin Pines, it was called. 5 cabins, a mess hall, and a dock that groaned every time someone stepped wrong. I was the youngest of the staff that summer, mostly handling gear and teaching the kids how to cast without hooking themselves. We didn't get many locals, but Kyle was one. His Aunt Ruth ran the place, and that week she'd let him stay on site while his mom was off in Fairbanks. He was a good kid, quiet, observant, the kind who paid attention when you explained something once. Ruth asked me to keep an eye on him, make sure he stayed out of trouble. The day it happened started cold. Overcast skies and wind that smelled like moss and river mud. A few guests were already out on the boats, bundled in layers and barely talking. Kyle had stayed behind, said he wasn't feeling great. I saw him around mid-morning, standing near the fire pit, flipping through a laminated trail map. I didn't think much of it. Later, around lunch, Ruth came looking for him. He say where he was going, she asked, already half in her boots. I told her no. She frowned and said, he knows better than to wander without a guide. We split up and checked the usual spots, the mess hall, the woodshed, the cabins. No sign. It wasn't until I walked down past the backup fuel drums that I noticed one of the old trail gates was unlatched. The wind had caught it, swinging it slow just enough to creak. That's when I saw the footprints. One set, too small for an adult, headed straight into the woods. I followed them. The trail wasn't marked on our guest maps. It was one of the older ones used mostly by hunters and delivery sleds when the river iced up. I hadn't gone down it much myself. It wound through dense spruce and willow, eventually dropping toward a side creek that always ran too cold for fishing. About 10 minutes in, I found Kyle. He was standing on the trail, facing a man I didn't recognize. The man was crouched low, soaking wet like he'd fallen through ice, though we were miles from anything deep. He wore a fishing vest that looked a few decades out of date, the kind with sun-faded patches and torn mesh pockets. His hands were empty, but his eyes were locked on Kyle's steady, like he was trying to convince him of something. I called out before I really thought about it. "Hey." They both turned. Kyle looked surprised. The man didn't. He stood up slowly, nodded once like he understood something, then walked into the trees. Not ran, just turned and disappeared through the brush. I started toward him, but Kyle grabbed my arm. "Don't," he said. We got back to camp without a word between us. Ruth was waiting on the porch, worry stretched across her face. When I told her what I saw, she froze. "No guests are missing," she said, "and there's no locals out here right now. We reported it. A trooper came by that evening, Officer Leach. I'd met him once before when he came to check on a noise complaint. He walked the trail with me, found the footprints and the patch of wet moss where the man had crouched. He took a report, asked Kyle some questions, then left just before dark. Said he'd check with the villages downstream in case someone wandered off. That night, Kyle wouldn't eat. He just sat on the porch, wrapped in a camp blanket, looking out toward the woods. I brought him some cocoa, sat beside him a while. "He said he was a guide," Kyle murmured after a long silence. I asked what kind of guide. He said he helps people who get left behind. Kyle answered that he only comes back when someone lets him. The next day, Ruth asked me to take Kyle into town, said his mom would meet us there early. We packed his things and drove the hour to Bethel. Before we left, he handed me the trail map he'd been looking at earlier. On the back, written in pencil, was a single word: almost. I don't know what it meant, and I didn't ask. Weeks later, I mentioned it to one of the float plane pilots, an older guy who knew every stretch of that river basin. When I described the man, he got quiet, said someone by that name had vanished on the Kuskokwim back in the 90s. Guide for a winter expedition. The raft capsized. 2 guests made it to shore. He didn't. They never found the body. Just his fishing vest hanging from a pine branch 20 miles downriver. Still zipped. I never saw Kyle again. Ruth kept the lodge open another season, then sold it to a couple from Sitka. They bulldozed the old cabins and put in solar panels. The gate by the drums is gone now. So is the trail. But sometimes I still dream of that man. Not his face, really just the weight of him. That sense you get when someone's watching you, not out of curiosity, but expectation. Like they're waiting for you to decide. I don't usually take up invitations from people I barely know, but that fall, something in me felt restless, like I needed to get far away from the world I understood. A friend of mine from the VFW, Drew, told me about a spot near McCarthy, Alaska, an old lodge being fixed up for wilderness tourists. He said the guy who ran it, Ronnie, was ex-Navy, solid quiet. The place had been shut for decades before Ronnie bought it. Now he was letting veterans stay cheap during the off-season just to get it broken in. I took the ferry to Valdez and made the long drive in tires grumbling over the gravel until the road vanished into forest. I'd brought a few cans of chili, a flashlight, and not much else. Ronnie met me out front when I arrived. Weathered man, gray, stubble coat, patched at the elbows. We didn't say much that night. He handed me a key, pointed me toward the guest wing, and told me not to bother locking the door. "Ain't nobody around to sneak in," he said. Then he laughed, but it sounded more tired than amused. The place had a history. It used to be a guide station for mining crews and wilderness photographers back in the 70s. Then one winter, everyone just left. No fire, no crime. Just emptied out. The walls creaked like they remembered it. My room was small, wood paneling, one narrow window. There was an old calendar still pinned near the bed, November 1981, sun-faded and curling at the corners. I didn't touch it. The first night was uneventful. Cold air snuck through the floorboards and the wind made the pine trees click against the siding. I slept light, but didn't think much of it. Until the second night. It was just after 2 a.m. when I woke up. No sound, no wind. Just a strange stillness like everything outside had paused. I wasn't sure what pulled me out of sleep, but I had that dry-mouthed, cold-palmed feeling that said I wasn't alone. At first, I thought I was hearing things. A soft, dragging noise, like someone moving across the hallway carpet in bare feet. I stayed still, listened. Then it stopped, and something tapped the window glass, once soft but deliberate. Now that didn't make much sense. My room was on the second floor, and there was no balcony. I got out of bed slowly and flicked on the flashlight I kept beside me. Walked to the window, careful not to get too close. Nothing, just fog on the glass. But there were 4 faint smears, as if fingertips had slid slowly downward before vanishing. In the morning, I asked Ronnie if there were animals that climbed that high. He gave me a look that lasted too long, then just said, "Nothing that wants to be seen." That day, I walked the property. There were old paths, half swallowed by moss, and a crumbling tool shed near the tree line with its roof caved in. I found a set of boot prints going around the back of the lodge, big ones. Not mine, not Ronnie's. Too clean to be more than a day old. When I mentioned them, he just nodded. "Sometimes folks come through," he said. "They don't always knock." That night I heard the dragging sound again, closer this time, pausing then starting up again. It stopped right outside my door. I waited heart-pounding until it moved again, slower now, as if whoever it was had started crawling. At 2:47 a.m., exactly the air changed. Not temperature, just pressure, like being underwater. And I swear the calendar on the wall flipped itself to December. I didn't sleep after that. On the 4th morning, I packed early and told Ronnie I'd be heading out. He didn't try to stop me, just walked me out to the gravel drive and stood there while I loaded my things. Before I left, he handed me a thermos and said one last thing. "Sometimes the lodge remembers people who didn't leave right." I asked him what he meant. He shrugged. "It remembers who stayed too long. The road back felt longer than when I came in. And when I stopped for gas in Chitina, the clerk asked if I'd come down from McCarthy. I said I had. He asked if I'd seen anyone else up there. I told him just the caretaker. He went quiet for a second. Then he said, "That place has been padlocked for years." I didn't answer, just paid for my gas and kept driving. That was the last one I'll share tonight. Some of these places I stayed in were never meant to feel like home. They were just temporary motels, cabins, side road pit stops on the way to somewhere else. But maybe that's what makes them dangerous. You let your guard down when you think something isn't supposed to matter. Alaska's got more space than most people can imagine. It can hold secrets bigger than towns. And sometimes the worst thing isn't what's waiting in the woods, It's what remembers you, long after you leave. I still don't know what I heard or what followed me to that lodge, but I think about that calendar, about the prints, and about how some places don't forget, even when you do. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If you'd like to hear more stories like these, feel free to follow the channel. Share this with someone who enjoys a quiet chill and subscribe for future nights. And tell me, have you ever stayed somewhere that felt wrong even when nothing was obviously out of place? Until next time, be careful where you rest your head. Good night.